Yo, I'm Toycat, and one of the biggest shames about living in a country that 75 years ago used to be one of the great world powers is that since that's ended, there's been a basic non-stop decline in the UK. Certainly in my adult life, things always look like staying flat is the best we can possibly accomplish, but in the last few years, and really in the last few months, we've seen that situation kind of reverse. In a time that is turbulent for the entire world, the UK looks like it's doing surprisingly well, both in terms of its domestic growth situation, but also we have Canada, after its rebuking from their neighbour to the south, coming over to the UK and saying, okay, let's finally work out that trade agreement. We have the situation where even that big disruptor to world foreign policy, ever since he learned that Britain has dibs on Greenland, has been oddly complimentary of our Prime Minister. Again, very strange, but at least functional. And similarly, the EU, which we had a bit of an ex-wife situation with, has finally started saying, you know what, let's have this Brexit reset. Sure, you're not a member anymore, but let's work out the closest relationship it will be possible to build together, seeing us as a partner rather than as an ex-partner, I guess you could say. And that is the wonderful situation that I want to bring up in this video, which is the geopolitical situation in the UK right now and why I personally am optimistic about it. So first things first, it has to be mentioned that yeah, in the world right now we have two of the great free economic powers basically becoming more and more insular. Here is a map of world economies, global GDP from 2021, divided into three colors, that being the usual business units that countries have, the Europe, Middle East and Africa, then we've got the Americas together, including Greenland weirdly, and then we've got Asia, which also includes Oceania, because it's just, you know, you wouldn't make a fourth grouping for it, even though they barely link in, and so that divides the world into three almost equally sized economies. And looking at this, you can kind of see that, like, oh yeah, within the sphere of Oceania, Asia, you've got one big power, and they are, you know, they're pro-trade when it suits them, and then you've got in the Americas, you've got a big power, indeed, the United States is the overwhelming majority of their GDP, and you can see like, oh yeah, they're also pro-trade when it suits them, and maybe anti-trade when it doesn't. And so within Europe, you've got this weird thing where, kind of like the whole world, where it's kind of three big powers, a multipolar order, you've got a multipolar order within Europe. This is perhaps one of the big reasons why we've always been warring as a continent, because every one of these economies would say, yeah, we deserve to be the people that lead this whole thing collectively, and then, you know, long story short, the multipolar order within Europe worked maybe when we were 75% of the world's, stuff, but nowadays it doesn't work, and so that's why the EU arguably needed to exist as a trading bloc, as a political entity, whatever way you want to see it. That's why people believe the European Union is necessary, and so leaving that union seems pretty darn reckless, right? To go into a world and say, yeah, the big thing which is keeping Europe together, let's leave that aside, and the only way you could possibly say that makes any sense is if you are on, because, you know, ultimately, we live in a world where security has already been more or less worked out. You know, there are more and more threats, but if you look at the world GDP, look at any country with a GDP substantially above $1 trillion, and you can see the only countries which are outside of like the Western world order, you know, like broadly, we will protect each other if it comes to it, are like India, and then like Brazil down here, and then we've got Iran, I guess you could say, and then we've got China, I guess, as the very, very big one. But like, largely speaking, it's like, okay, on a security level, the world more or less functions. That is something you can thank the US for if you want to. You can thank all of the other countries involved in making that work. Or yeah, but interestingly, there is also the issue of, okay, then what about trade? Your goal as a country is to get your little blob here being the biggest, and again, having the UK go from being at one point one of the big trading entities of the world to being this tiny little blob on a map is a darn shame. But how do you improve your situation? At least, even if not on a, you're never going to become a China or US sized entity without, you know, having all of Europe join together, and that would be unthinkable. So what can you do otherwise? I would say the best possible situation is to somehow work out how you can be between all three of these blocks. I think the UK's position on this chart, which is from Visual Capitalist, I'm sure they're not trying to be super pro UK here, but like their situation is like, yeah, actually the UK is nicely situated to somehow be very good friends with all three of these groups, and I think that's what's broadly happening. So first things first, I do need to clarify that even though Canada is opening trade talks, and that seems like incredible news, weirdly enough, it was actually the UK who closed those trade talks on the 25th of January. Basically, it's because we just concluded not enough progress was being made. We set up an agreement with Canada that was exactly mirroring our EU agreement, and we've tried to make a closer one, but it hasn't worked. Similarly, if you actually look at if you look at the situation that the UK has with the EU, It's called the UK EU UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. If you actually look at this agreement, you'll see like, oh yeah, so we have an idea. It's nuts. If you look into it, people say like, oh, we cut off our closest ally, but it's like no, trading goods between the EU and the UK has no tariffs or quotas. You can trade as much as you like, and you can't treat it, like it's there are certain issues of like custom formalities, but that's about the only problem there. Actual trade and tariffs are zero. Indeed, in services, which is the big thing the UK does and buys internationally, each party treats services as no favorably less than its own. In other words, the UK has an agreement that, if you think about the world in terms of tariffs alone, is 100% the same as what it was while we were in the EU. So what is the difference here? Why is it that we need to seek closer relationships? One of those is like obviously security, but the other thing is like, oh, because the biggest thing about trade now is not actually tariffs. Tariffs exist all around the world, and I'm sure there's someone out there who would love to remind you how tariffs are a great way to cut down trade if you want to. But realistically, in the modern world, most countries have known that tariffs are just a way to tax your own consumers on other countries' stuff. Like in the long run, you can protect some industries, but it's going to cost you money, or at least it's going to cost you effectively, like you're going to be raising prices on your domestic consumers. Everyone has known that for a very long time. And so what is it that the UK needs to do to actually improve their trade with the EU and Canada in a world where the traditional pioneer of free trade is becoming a little bit more China, where they're saying, yeah, we love free trade when it's on our terms and on our terms exclusively. So what does the UK have to do to be like pro that? If we're already in a situation where we basically don't tariff things, and this is the messy thing that I want to bring up with this video, which is that most trade agreements now, and the reason that most trade agreements fail, including the biggest one in the world, it's the TTIP, which I'll leave aside the dumb things, I guess, like people coming in and being like, we need to stop this trade agreement. Who wants Americans in our country? Nestle and Coca-Cola, these companies want this trade agreement, and so we don't want it. Broadly saying that the more free trade you have, the fewer human rights you have. Again, there's some people from the UK being like, yeah, I think it's going to cause modern day serfdom if we have a trade agreement between Europe and North America. It's a very, very spicy situation, I guess you could say, and I'm not going to dive into that. But the actual problem with this is not like, oh yeah, Europe and America don't want to trade more. Obviously you could argue like there are some people who look at it and say, oh, why is it that America gets to, but why does America sell fewer things than Europe does? The US to EU trade is only 1806 billion. What is that, like 1.8 trillion euros, whereas EU to US trade is 2.1. The Donald Trumps of the world will focus on that number as the reason why it shouldn't. A lot of people will say, yeah, even though this could create a lot of growth in the world, that growth is going to be unequally spread, but that's kind of a game theory way of thinking about it. The much bigger problem, and the reason it hasn't come about, is because of, let's go to this fun national objection section, because the ultimate reason that I think all trade agreements are starting to fail are what are called non-trade barriers. So in the case of the biggest thing that actually both Canada wants from the UK and that the United States wants from Europe is basically broadly put down to the idea of you should let our crops and our beef into your market. What the EU would call this is hormone-treated beef and genetically modified organisms, and what Americans and Canadians would call this is beef and crops. Why can't we sell you our beef and crops? Because even though there is no tariff on selling beef to Europe, there is a fundamental, to actually be able to sell it, and therefore for anyone to want to buy it, you actually have to meet certain standards, and those standards include not putting hormones in the beef or not genetically modifying your, and that becomes a very spicy political issue very, very quickly. In the case of, if you actually look at the EU ban on hormone-treated beef, as a European, you'll be like, what do you mean? We should just let go of that ban, but the reason we ban it is based on the precautionary principle. We're saying there's no scientific proof that it's bad, but we think that it might be, and so we'd rather not do it until we find out for sure that it's not. In other words, the Europeans, and the UK is included in this, say, yeah, let's not do something, let's wait till we know something is safe before we do it, whereas the North American model in this exact same field, where there are far more cattle farmers, but their model is like, let's wait until something is dangerous to stop doing it. You could argue that really reflects the North American American way of life in so many aspects, the way that they still build the cities and the world around them, whereas the European model is like, yeah, let's build around what works. We've been around for a long time and we've seen a lot of failures. Let's wait until we know something is going to be a success. This is why Europe doesn't have a tech industry and America does. And so if you want to have trade agreements, you have to start working out things like that, because even though there is no tariff between the United States and Europe, there effectively is an infinite percent tariff if American farmers aren't going to set up special EU versions of their farms of no hormones, and that creates a non-tariff barrier. The non-tariff barrier is basically the biggest problem. I think once you get to like the third world, you dive into a whole bunch of issues of like, what if they have censorship? This is something India runs into a lot with tech companies, but like, what about embargoes? What about foreign exchange restrictions? Some countries will not let you change their money in non-standard ways. Venezuela and Iran come to my mind there, but lots of normal, Western world countries will say, yeah, you're not actually allowed to just take our money out of our country. And so the idea of licenses are a fair thing to have from a perspective of politics, but if you require a license to sell something that can only be obtained in the UK, you're effectively saying other countries can't do this without going through an extra burden. The idea of professional regulations, that if you look at basically every single issue of modern trade, it comes down to this. It comes down to the problem of, another example is chickens in the United States are treated less humanely, and but therefore they farm far more with the same number of resources. Their chicken is far cheaper because they can treat their chickens less humanely, and then they can wash them. It's called like chlorinated chicken is what people say, but actually when you look into it, it's like, yeah, the reason we don't like it is not because the chlorine is bad, we just use that as a negative point, it's because we don't think they should treat chickens so inhumanely, whereas here, we'd rather treat them well. If you open up markets, you're either saying that the entire European chicken industry has to start treating its chickens more inhumanely or lose out to American chickens, or you're saying the inverse. You're saying that American chickens have to go up in price so they can meet our standards. You get to this point where politics, becomes everything, and that is the reason that I think that to actually get movement done in trade deals, you need to start having these big questions, and you need to start questioning what is more important, an extra few percent of GDP growth or this? And I think the answer should be, yeah, of course it's the extra few percent of GDP. Every single one of these issues that the UK has just announced, from the Oxford-Cambridge corridor to pension reforms to the new runway at Heathrow to the idea of having all of these different ideas be launched. Oh, there we go, airport expansion at Heathrow, to theme parks even. Every single thing that you approve and you say, yeah, we should have more things happening because things are what make money work, someone is like, oh, I think there are things that are more important than money, don't you? But actually, no. The funny thing is, every single person loves to believe they think there are things that are substantially more important than money. I think that, on an abstract level, like, do I want hormones in my beef? If you ask me on a split second, do I want it, yes or no? I might say yes or no, but if you say, oh yeah, in exchange for that, we're going to lose out on, approximately a $500 billion amount of trade because that holds up a lot of other trade stuff, you get into a messy world. The inverse situation is the US. The EU currently can't bid on certain government contracts in the United States, which they think they should have the rights to, but the United States says they can't bid on certain healthcare contracts in Europe because a lot of European countries have very strictly regulated healthcare industries, so you should deregulate your healthcare industries if you want us to let you bid on our government contracts, and you end up going down a real long rabbit hole, which basically ends with the idea of like, yeah, we are reaching a bit of a political impasse in the world, but I think that there is an optimistic solution of if the world starts to say, yeah, we want to trade with each other more, if we want this so bad, we can find those solutions. And it's just, the solutions get very messy very quickly, but I hope that that's what happens, if not with the broader European, again, I think the absolute dream that could come out of something like this coming out is the idea of like, because, like if you look into it, if Canada signs a deal with the EU, which it has, if Canada signs a deal with the UK, if the UK has a deal with the EU and the EU has an agreement with the US, you could get basically, the NATO countries all in a giant, plus the ones that aren't, all in a giant trading bloc. You could create the world's largest economy, But I also have to say at the very end here, this is the dream. This is the thing I would advocate for, even if it meant eating, even if it meant having crops that are genetically modified, whatever that even means. That feels like protectionism to me. But yeah, I would say that even though it's like a lot of struggle, that is the thing that I think should be the end goal. We have the most unique situation in the world where out of the world economy, a decent majority all has shared cultural values and all manage to come from the same continent with the same, more or less defined values. That is a nutty thing that we have that is only going to get further away as time and immigration to all of the countries changes the world thing. Wouldn't it be nice if we could have one of the world's largest actually integrated economies too? That's my hot take for today. Anyway, with that said, if we can't have it, I'll totally accept a UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia trade deal. I'm just saying, Kanzuk, it's the thing I'll shill for. But in the meantime, why not get the US and the EU involved too? That's what I'm saying. Let's say in response to the Russias, the Chinas, and the Indies of the world that are getting real skeptical about the world, let's say like, oh yeah, this is what you do. You come to an agreement about your values, and you work out the thing that makes your people richer, even if it makes your politicians uneasy. But that's just my personal take. Thank you for watching. This has been my optimistic glance into the UK's future, and I think that even if the world is going to this point where even what you might consider Western allies are starting to not get along, I hope the UK can prove to be as the perfect middle point between Europe and North America. If not the mediator that allows this all to happen, I hope the UK can be in a position where even if the US and the Canada are real suspicious of the EU, they're less suspicious of us, and reverse with the EU and, like the English-speaking world. The UK is the conduit into it, and hopefully we can be used that way. Yeah, use us real hard, world economy. Send your money here, and oh yeah, it'd be so terrible if you started building things and investing in our country. Oh no, I'd hate it if you made us all a bit richer. Okay, there's my political stance. Putting it out there, and I hope that you enjoyed, because I'll see you. I know it's gonna be a little controversial to throw it out into the world, to be so pro-free trade that you'd eat genetically modified crops or be in favor of nuclear energy. But yeah, I think we should totally say growth is priority one, and everything else, you need to justify why it's worth becoming poorer. Yeah, that's my take. Hope you enjoyed. Second channel, don't care. Goodbye. Oh, I think I want to do a terrible maps thing. I feel like basically every major world geopolitical story is just Trump wanders into another region and says, hey, what if we messed around with this? So I'm thinking that what might be fun instead is to go through some more terrible maps. Maybe some great maps, but I'll do a little map roundup of the week, probably starting soon. So look forward to that. And second channel, don't care. Goodbye.